Great. Take it away, Phil.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jenna. Appreciate it. And thanks everybody for making time tonight to talk about completing green streets in Cleveland. What I'm going to do tonight, what I want to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the process. We're going to get in the weeds a little bit because I think it's important, especially people that are on this call. I think that, it's probably a mix of folks who are kind of generally interested in how Cleveland runs its program. But I also think it's important, it's really actually very important for bike advocates, Safe Street advocates, to understand kind of the nuts and bolts of how these projects work because it's the details that really matter. And it's also helpful to understand how the details work because it, I think, will help you better understand why we cannot or not cannot, but why we do certain projects certain ways and why we can or can't do some things on other projects. So I'm going to walk through that. And I hope by the end of my few slides that I have here, you have a better understanding, but we'll leave plenty of time for question and answer to talk about anything you want to talk about. So I'm going to start there. And we are going to start with, everybody can see the screen, I assume. And we'll start with a little bit of background. So let's first start about what we mean when we say complete in Green Street. So a complete street is one that means that we are designing it for everybody. So pedestrians, bicyclists, and motorists. That's important because, especially the climate of things these days, this work often can be villainized in a way. It's like, bikes and people versus cars. And that's really not the case with a lot of these designs. Yes, in many cases, are we adding, bike lanes, and we'll call them facilities if you want the engineering term, but these facilities that we're adding to these projects, are they there to accommodate bikes and pedestrians and slow traffic? And yes, it is. But guess what? It's also a way to make the streets safer for everyone, including those who drive by vehicle on the street. So a lot of times these are ways to make these streets calmer, um, because we have so much extra street capacity, meaning like we have way more road than we need in today's Cleveland and other communities around Cleveland. So these are safety projects in addition to building out networks for bike connections or improving things for pedestrians who use the street quite often. So that's an important thing as advocates out there. When you're talking about these projects, think of phrasing this work in that way to folks that are skeptical of it. So a number of the projects that we'll talk about at the end are examples of that. You'll see how the crash data shows how dangerous those streets were, and by adding some of these extra design elements, what we're trying to achieve there from safety. So that's complete. And then green is, trying to add green infrastructure. And when we say green infrastructure, a lot of times what we're referring to at a baseline level is adding, street or adding tree lawn, street trees, maybe some additional green space if we're going to build like kind of curb cuts that come out at the intersections. In more elaborate cases, things like bioretention, bioswales, things like that. But I would say that the majority of our projects in Cleveland, we focus on the basics of really just your basic tree lawn and tree planting. And the reason why is because we have way too much concrete on particular streets that are complete green streets. These are big corridors. These are sidewalks that are 12, 15 or more feet in some cases. They were built for a Cleveland back, 80 or so years ago, 70, 80 years ago, when we had way more people living here, way more commercial traffic on these corridors, way more pedestrian traffic on these corridors. And that was the priority then, was you needed all that space to accommodate, drop off, pickup, parking, foot traffic. Now our goals are reversed, or not reversed, but they're on the other end of the spectrum in the sense that we have issues with low tree canopy cover in the city. We have issues with stormwater management. We have combined sewer overflow issues. We still have discharges into Lake Erie in our waterways. One of the best ways we can address that is on these roadway projects, these complete and Green Street projects, is adding as much green space as we can instead of all that concrete, and soak up that stormwater and give us space for planting trees. And there's also other benefits to that. It reduces the urban heat effect. And there's lots of people in the city of Cleveland where we do these projects. They may not have a car. They're walking to the grocery store. That's their route. And instead of on a 15-foot super hot sidewalk next to a sea of asphalt in the street in a July day, imagine if there was 150 trees now on that street, and they still have adequate 6-foot sidewalk, let's just say, and a street that it's maybe a little bit designed a little bit better where there isn't so much car traffic going through it. And so that's what we mean by green. So when we talk about these projects moving forward, those are the two central concepts for Complete and Green Street. So what's unique about Cleveland? So in 2011, we started to realize, listen, we got to get serious about this with our roadway design. And so the city in 2011 did pass what I would describe as kind of a 1.0 ordinance for Complete and Green Street work. And it was okay. I mean, it gave us some design guidance, but really it didn't put a lot of teeth on the policy. So it was still kind of felt like, yes, we shall do this if we can. And, when you're not clear about expectations and creating accountability and things built into design, in a city like Cleveland, where there's infinite need and always very little resources, these are the Complete and Green Street work sometimes can seem like a frill or something extra. And that's what ends up happening a lot of times. Or you get kind of inferior design because you don't have enough people providing input into the design process. So when the Bibb administration came in, along with some of all their council people, one of the priority agenda items was to update that 2011 ordinance and put more teeth on it. So when they did that, you can see below here some of the things that we did to add teeth. One of the most important things was we formed an actual appointed committee at City Hall that is a 10-person committee. And there's a slide on this and how this is broken down, but basically it's an appointed committee between the mayor and city council. This is a group of kind of like subject matter experts with also residents who are taking a look at projects, possible projects that could be Complete and Green Street projects well in advance, several years in advance before we get into design. And they look at that and they provide feedback and say, okay, here's our comments in terms of what we think a Complete and Green Street could look like on this road. And so those comments help us inform preliminary design, like before we go into it. We're not going right into a design situation and trying to figure it out as we go. And what would happen in the past oftentimes is the engineering department in City Hall would know a project's coming up, but the community might not know that the project's coming up. And then they would start their design, and then they would go to the community with an initial design, and that community might say, like, well, what the hell? We wanted way more street greening here. We wanted, bike lanes. We wanted all the things. And, they're kind of like, well, we don't have the budget for that. And, this is the best we can do. And you have 30 days to comment, and we might, tweak a few things here and there. So that wasn't always the case. I mean, I want to give credit to some extent to our engineering department of trying to do the best they can with those constraints. But point is that, we needed a better process to help support their work. And so this advisory committee is a step in that process, is to start getting that feedback early on so that we could plan accordingly. If we know this is going to be a project that's going to be more than just resurfacing and fixing some crosswalks, and it's going to be several $1 million more, we need to start budgeting for that years in advance or finding additional resources for it. So that's kind of the part of the committee. The other important thing was that when this ordinance was passed, we hired more staff, and we hired more staff in different departments. So my position is in capital projects with the engineers. So I'm a planner, but I'm in with the engineers. But we also hired some more actual staff in planning to help us with design and engagement. and also in traffic engineering, which is also the other very important department, because they're the ones that are going to say thumbs up or thumbs down if we can do certain things on design. So we have hired approximately 6 to 7 new people, all embedded in these different departments. And the idea is for these folks to work together and communicate on these projects in advance and start to work through the design, so that it's all not left on the plate of the engineering department or any, the traffic engineer or whatnot. So that's number two. That's really a big thing. And we refer to that as the mobility team. So you'll see me reference that later. There's a slide on it. The other thing with this ordinance is it requires that we have a actual active transportation plan. Every 5 years, it has to be updated. So we have a 5-year plan. We just passed our first 5-year plan since 2007. And that was the Cleveland Moves plan, got passed this year. And that is like our Bible. That is our guiding document as to the things, the network, the roadways, the priority areas, things like that, that we really want to make sure that if any roadway projects are coming up on those segments in the Cleveland Moves plan, that we are treating them like complete and Green Street. We are trying to find all the resources we can to get into those projects to make them the best we can. So Cleveland Moves is a very important thing in this work at City Hall, in complete and Green Streets in particular. That is our guiding document. And then the last thing here is we do an annual report at the end of the year. So we talk about, okay, here's all the accomplishments. Here's how many lanes of bike miles we did, how many extra protected elements we added, how many trees we planted on these streets. And it isn't necessarily just complete and Green Street projects, roadway projects. We look at it holistically, like on side residential street projects, did we partner with someone to help, do tree planting there? Or with some of our quick build projects, we had a council person who they might have gave us $100,000 to help improve crosswalks and do daylighting and other things like that. All of that goes into the report, because that is a more holistic look at what we did in a given year in Cleveland. So it's kind of all of the above. And what we're going to do moving forward is we're going to combine the Complete and Green Street report with the Cleveland Moves report, and also Vision Zero. And Vision Zero is another program at City Hall, like other cities have, and that's to really look at improving safety conditions in high crash segments in Cleveland. So we have a whole person, Cameron Roberts, he's fantastic, who works just on that and is part of our mobility team and helps us with that data and helps us kind of refine some of our design and where to prioritize things. So moving forward, this month, we're working on that consolidated report, which you'll see moving up. And then one thing I did in my role, which maybe some of you on this call are familiar with, I realized quickly whenever I started this job was that there is so much actually happening month to month. Like an annual report is really just a snapshot. There's so much going on month to month here. I just started producing a monthly newsletter, which, I try to bring in the information from not just City Hall, but what's going on at Bike Cleveland and Better Streets and the Cleveland Tree Coalition folks and the Park and Green Space folks and everybody in between, and summarize that in a concise way that gives anybody in Cleveland or anybody who's interested in this work a pretty good, thorough understanding of what's going on. And then other things too. It's like, here's some recommended reading that you should consider. These were like, here's what Pittsburgh's doing this month. Here's what Detroit did on this bike lane project, just so you are having some point of reference too from other communities about, what our neighbors around us are doing, so that from a comparative standpoint and just from an educational standpoint too. So that's a little bit of background. This is what informs us. So when I was talking about Cleveland Moves, these are some other plans too that help inform our work. I won't go through all, well, I guess I'll just quickly go through some of these, but the ones that are bolded are the ones that we really pay attention to specifically, because they're city adopted plans, and they're ones that we want to make sure that if there's anything in these plans that they get included in Complete and Green Street work. So that's Cleveland Moves, Vision Zero Action Plan, which is about safety, and the Climate Action Plan, which is about sustainability. So those three things really guide our work. There's also the Cleveland Tree Plan. Cleveland has only a 17% tree canopy rate, and we need to get to 30 That's a minimum standard for most cities. That means we would have to plant 30,000 trees every single year in Cleveland between now and 2040. That's a tremendous amount of work, but that plan helps us know where we need to really focus. So if we're in Huff, for example, and we're doing the Wade Park Avenue project, and we know that that canopy rate in Huff is 18%, well, we've got to definitely get as much street grading in on that project as possible. Or if we know on St. Clair, we got a project coming up, and on St. Clair, that's like the number 2 location for crashes in the city of Cleveland. Well, then we've got to find additional resources to be able to do as much safety design as we can on that segment of St. Clair. So that's an example. Other partners plans, so the RTA's plan, they're doing their bus rapid transit plan on West 25th Street right now, and they're going to be doing another one on Broadway. We want to make sure that our work and our vision and stuff like that aligns with what they're trying to do and work on that. Safe routes to school is another resource opportunity. Almost all of Cleveland qualifies for safe routes to school. And we've been able, because of our Cleveland Moves plan, to apply for that again. And we got $1 million from that this year for East 55th Street, which by Cleveland helped quite a bit with a new design for East 55th. So that's an example of, using our plan there to leverage resource. NOACA, which is our regional planning organization around transportation, they have funding sources that are more than just what they normally get for roadway projects. One is what we'll refer to as TLCI. These are smaller grants, but they help us do specific types of projects. An example of that would be on Lakeshore Boulevard in North Collinwood. We're building a trail project with the county on the lake to connect the Euclid Beach Park all the way over to a road that will connect into Lakeshore Boulevard, which is the Lakefront Bikeway. Well, it's going to come out on a really dangerous curve on East 152nd Street. And that improving that crosswalk area or creating a crosswalk area is not part of the funding for the trail project. So we had to figure out a way of what is a good funding source to be able to fund that. And the TLCI program is where we have focused. And that would be an example of how those dollars are used. And then Bike Cleveland has their own planning with City Thread. That's really helped inform a lot of, how we think about like Cleveland Moves and some other work. And we meet with Bike Cleveland monthly to go through things in that plan. And then there's other things like, walk audits with neighbors that the Better Street committees do, and other neighborhood and corridor plans that maybe a community development corporation put together, or, some group. We read those and we see what the priorities are there. Example of that would be on East 66th Street. They did a plan for that area, and we use that plan to help us do a $9 to almost $10 million complete and Green Street project on East 66 in partnership with the Cleveland Foundation. So all of this goes into how we look at different projects and in the work. Okay, I'm not going to go through all this, but this is the cycle of like this is who's all involved in this work. So this is like the flow of stuff. But the big 3, which I've already mentioned, are traffic engineering, planning, and capital projects, otherwise known as MOCAP. This is some of the stuff that each one of those departments does. In general, traffic engineering is to make sure that what we're designing is safe and it will work. They are responsible also for some other things like maybe helping with coming in on striping with quick build projects. They handle the speed table programs, things like that. Planning staff helps us with developing things like Cleveland Moves. They definitely help us with engagement and also securing additional funds for projects. The Wade Park Avenue project, which we'll look at in a few slides, we only had money to do like resurfacing and, maybe some other things like ADA crosswalk repair, but planning came in and said, all right, let's go after this funding and this funding and this funding from these different sources. And they added an additional $3.3 million to that project. Now we're going to be able to do roundabouts, protected bike lanes all the way through, and street grading all the way through. So that's an example of that partnership. And then capital projects, that's the department that that's the nuts and the bolts and the details. That's the group that actually has to do all the detailed design. They have to figure out how they're going to fund it. They're going to have to figure out any real estate stuff, like if we need easements, all that stuff, anything like that. All the nitty gritty. I don't want to call it boring because it's important, but that's the group that's going to build your project construction. Because it's one thing to plan a project, it's another thing to construct a project. Those are things that have to work together, but they are different animals. And you see here below how some of these other departments, we're constantly seeking input from these sustainability, making sure that what we're doing on the greening works. Same with urban forestry. Public safety always has input because, if we're designing a roundabout or some kind of narrowed intersection with a street and they can't get a fire truck through there, or EMS has an issue with getting access to something, we need to know that because that's going to definitely affect our design. And then public works, of course, is incredibly important because they're the department who is going to maintain a lot of this work, and that traffic engineering is in there. But whatever we're building, someone's got to maintain it, and public works is that department. So drilling down from there, when we talk about the mobility team, it's like where do those people live? This is how this has worked when we rolled things out. You can see here, this is like the whole city's org chart, but basically this is where everybody's coming from. Mobility team lives in public works is traffic engineering. You see MOCAP, capital projects, and city planning. And then Callie Mersman was the mayor's senior strategist for transportation. She's now the city planning director. So that position has a little bit different of a title, but that person also in the mayor's cabinet still participates in this work too. But these are the departments that work together to deliver you a complete and Green Street project that works with all the other departments. So this is what it's looking like. Okay, so now you know a little bit about the ordinance, the background, what we mean when we talk about complete and Green Street, what departments are involved in, at least in Cleveland, how that works. But let's talk for a minute about what we call the TAC. I call it the Complete and Green Street Committee. But this is the committee that I mentioned before, that was formed with the new ordinance. This is the 10-person appointed committee. And you can see here in this list who all those appointments are. So we have a mayoral appointment, a council appointment. Usually the council person, it's the person whoever chairs the Transportation Mobility Committee. Until he cycled out, it was Kerry McCormick, and now it's Charles Slife. But you can see who else is here. It's ODOT, NOACA, RTA. We have the sewer district. We have an advocacy representative. That's Jacob from the executive director of Bike Cleveland. He's actually the chair of the committee. We have someone from a disability organization. In this case, it's Beth Glass from LEAP. She's great. And then we have 2 residents. And usually these are 2 people that are picked by the mayor and council to represent the interests of the community. And these usually have backgrounds in complete and Green Street work. And that's Jeff Sleesman and Andre Daly. Those are our 2 representatives right now. So this is the group that takes a look at the very beginning of a project, the initial feedback. And how we present information to them is we used to just give them like, okay, here's this road we're thinking about as a complete and Green Street project. Here's all the data on it. And then just open it up to raw comment. And we realized that like, that's okay, but that's not actually helpful. Like it would probably be better because we have staff now to kind of let the city transportation team first kind of develop some concepts that we know that the TAC's going to probably say anyway, and then have a more detailed and productive conversation about, maybe refining some of that. And that's something that the TAC has really liked. They really like being able to look at something conceptually first, and then, let's go from there. And so this is an example of what we present to the TAC at the meetings. This is a software called Remix. If anybody out there in other communities is thinking about what kind of software might be very user-friendly, very easy to use, but also very useful, not only to present to in your own, like City Hall or whatever, whoever it may be, but also just to the public. Because what's great about Remix is it's kind of like, like you can build these elements, you can add these elements to a Google Street Map, but also people can add their specific comments. They can drop little comment bubbles on all these little things. So if someone says like, hey, at this intersection, there's a lot of pedestrian traffic that crosses here at this time because school lets out 2 blocks away here. They can drop that kind of a specific detailed note here. That's really helpful for us in City Hall because we can look at that list very specifically in a location and say, okay, let's look at what we can do there, there, or there. But this is what the Complete Green Street, the TAC committee also looks at. So this is an example of Wade Park Avenue where, Wade Park, that project is in Huff and also University in Glenville. So it's from E66 all the way to the end of the city's limits past University Circle. So it's a very long road running 3 different neighborhoods. And so it's a tale of different, neighborhoods in some ways. But what we did as a mobility team is we put together a concept for what it could look like with protected bike lanes, taking out some signals and adding roundabouts, and cleaning up some areas where, like in this case, we are looking to eliminate one of the legs of this intersection here. This is like you're looking at Ansel, and to the right over here, this is the Cultural Gardens. This is Rockefeller Park. This is the on ramp or the off ramp up to Wade Park. This is the on ramp down to the Cultural Gardens. And so it's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-point intersection, very dangerous. This is an apartment building. This is an apartment building. People crossing here all the time to get down to the park. What can we do to improve this? Well, what if we ever eliminated this signal, made this more of a roundabout, neck down these, extended these curbs out, and then actually eliminate this leg of road. This is duplicative. We can move this curb all the way over, get rid of this pavement, and make this all green space, extend Rockefeller Park, and make this way safer. So this is a segment of this roadway project that we presented in a concept like this to the TAC. And then they can go in and give specific detailed comments in these locations. Why this is also helpful is, I hope I don't screw this up if I do this. We turn that, once we get comments from the TAC, into this, which is a project webpage. And this is then what we can share with the community. Once we get the tax feedback, we take that, we clean up the concept, we refine it a bit more. We can give that also to whoever we're going to hire to do the design for the project. We can actually show them that image and say, here's what we're looking to do. Give us a cost for what you think it would cost to design this project. But also, we create these project webpage that walks you through now. This is what we go to the community with. We have surveys, and we have one-pagers, and we have project signs that we put up on the corridor explaining everything. And down here, folks can click that link right there, and they can go to that same remix and offer their comments in a specific format. And we have more ways to participate. Like this explains what all these different elements are, how they can sign up to get project updates. So none of this used to exist. You never used to have these types of websites and ways to kind of participate. So this has been our approach to, how to seek different forms of feedback here. And I'm going to lose my presentation. I apologize. I'll find it here somewhere. Where did you go, presentation? Yep, there we go. Sorry. Okay, we're back. Okay. We're at 7:30. I'm going to speed through some of these. Okay, how long does it take? Everybody's like, why do these freaking projects take so long? Well, the reason why is because if you understand how funding and all this stuff works, 2 to 3 years is about right. When you want to do a project, let's say we want to do a Complete Green Street project today. Well, the thing is that there's a lot of projects that are scheduled to be built now in the next several years that were projects several years ago that we were doing all this work on then. It's a matter of getting it into a queue of things. And so when you start doing public engagement, when you start with the TAC and do all of that work, that could be anywhere between, let's say that's the beginning of the project phase. That work takes time to start to put together the concept, to get that to a design consultant so they can give you a proposal. You have to be able to get the contractor on board to do that. You're going to continue to do public engagement during that time. That whole process could take a year in and of itself, just getting all that lined up. Once you do that, what you're also doing at City Hall, nothing can happen, absolutely nothing can happen unless it goes in front of City Council. That's just every single thing in City Hall. You have to present legislation. City Council has to review it, and they have to authorize it. They may have their own feedback or questions. They have to also authorize your funding. To do that, you have to introduce legislation. that has to go to several committees, that has to go in front of the full body, and has to get approved. So that is a process that can take 6 months or so. And then when you get into actually doing the design work of the project, there's several phases to it. We've done all the preliminary stuff, but now we're going to go to the public with a preliminary design. That's what we would call stage one, or 30% design. It's basically where the public is seeing the first, like, kind of like, hey, this is what this project could look like. This is the public meeting, your big public meeting. And at that meeting, that's where we're going to say, okay, what do you like or don't like about this? What can we change? We don't want any surprises when we get into that meeting for the public. The public, we're not doing our jobs. If that's the first time they're seeing that project and we got bike lanes and street trees, there needs to be plenty of engagement before we get to that point, because at that point, there's not a whole lot we're going to be able to change, like nothing systemic that we want to add or even subtract after that. You got 30 days after that to kind of like make any changes, because after that, we got to spend the rest of the year doing all the engineering planning. That means like all the details, all the utility work, all that. And that takes a long time to do. And we're also figuring out what the funding is, how we're going to make sure the funding gets done. And then when we finally get ready to construct the project, complete and Green Street projects are kind of a big deal. They're like big projects. Sometimes they can take, 2 construction seasons, meaning like 2 summers to do them, depending on what it is. The Superior Midway project downtown, for example, it's going to go from Public Square to East 55th. That's a 2 construction season project, because it's like a lot of work that we have to do there. There's other smaller projects like the Memorial Bridges Loop, which is just kind of a shared use path, but I'm going to use that as an example of why you think that's just such a simple project. It's not a simple project, but that's going to only take 1 year. We're going to build it. We're going to start it in June this year. We're going to complete it by the end of November. Fingers crossed. But that's, all of that comes out to about 2 or 3 years for these types of projects. Now, we're talking about complete and Green Street and big roadway projects. We're not talking about quick build projects where we can just do some striping and protect it. That's a big focus for the city. We are doing lots of that, and that can happen a lot sooner. But when we're talking about Superior Midway, Wade Park, East 66th Street, Stokes Boulevard, Shaker Boulevard, those kind of big projects, these are probably start to end 2 to 3 year projects. And so there's a lot that goes into this, and you have to line funding up. The city doesn't just have funding that says like, let's do this now. We have to budget for this stuff several years out, because we already got funding lined up in this year for stuff that we planned 2 or 3 years before that. So that's the reason why these projects take so long. This is just all the funds, how it works, right? The city does not have some bag of cash at City Hall, like a discretionary bag of cash. And we say like, okay, let's fund this with this discretionary bag. No, we do not have that. How it works is all about leveraging the limited dollars we have. And I'm going to draw your attention over here to this last category, because this first part right here is the most important thing. We build these projects using bond dollars, municipal bond dollars. We have on average about $35 to $40 million to work with every year. Is that for just complete and Green Street? No, it is not. That includes all our big bridge projects that have to be done. That includes all our street resurfacing projects. We have on average every year about $5 to $6 million that we can kind of use for these bigger complete and Green Street type projects. How do we use that? We use it as match funds for this stuff over here. This is like NOACA's funds for projects. How these dollars usually work is they will give about 80% of the funding to you, and the city, Cleveland or other cities, have to come up with a match on that, usually about 20%. So we use this amount for our 20% matches on all this big stuff over here. That is what we have to figure out how to use. There's other sources that we can tap into here. Sometimes we use council discretionary funds for like quick build stuff, things like that. There's other partners that we partner with sometimes for some of the street greening or other things like that. But this is mostly how this works. This is why we don't have a lot of funds to be able to do all the things we want all the time. The timelines are one thing, like we're talking about, but it's also these limited amount of funds here, the 5 to 6 million. We have to make the best use of those dollars to maximize all of the leverage on this. If NOACA says we'll give you $1 million for this project, They're going to give us 800,000. We got to come up with 200,000. It's going to come out of this right here with our bonds. And that's been pretty consistent, about 35 to 40 million total just for this right here, and about 5 to 6 million. We'd love to see that increase, but that's what we call bond capacity is. That's what we have the credit line to be able to do right now. Okay, I'm going to finish with, I talked about planning a street project is one thing, but constructing it is a different thing. And I'm going to go back to that example I mentioned about the Memorial Bridges Loop. So the Memorial Bridges Loop, for those that are not familiar, is a project in downtown Cleveland, which is trying to connect the Detroit Superior Bridge over to the Guardians Bridge, and specifically on Huron Road, which is like where Tower City's at, and Ontario, which is where the Cavs Stadium's at and the ballpark's at. If anybody's ever tried to use that by bike or by foot, it's terrible. It's very dangerous. I would not recommend it really for either. But believe it or not, even given those conditions, it is the most utilized running route, that looping around those bridges, for particularly for run groups in Cleveland. There are hundreds and hundreds of people that use it every week. And if you're a cyclist, cross your fingers. I hope you have to be pretty confident to try to mix with traffic there. So one of the priority projects under this administration was to build a protected shared use path that would connect the bridges there so that it's a lot safer. So what we were talking about there was taking a lane off of Huron Road, like right here in this section here, and using that lane to create a protected, delineated shared use path, and then connecting it over here to Ontario, where there is a sidewalk already. There's no sidewalk on Huron right now, but on this side, Ontario does have a sidewalk, but it's very small. It's like 5 feet. There's utilities in the middle of the sidewalk. It's just bad. And so you have these big, wide streets, right, on both sides. Why? It should be easy. Let's extend the sidewalk and make it a wider sidewalk and build a path and stripe it. And on Huron, let's just take the lane and let's stripe it and build it out. And as simple as that sounds, and we had a budget of 1.432 million, you see here, and this is your little, like reference going back to how things are funded. We're fortunate to get a federal earmark from our congresswoman, but NOAC also gave us $1 million, and they said, we'll give you 800K. You got to come up with 200K. So what we had to work with was 1.4-ish million dollars. And we designed something for that amount. What we learned as we went through this was there were all kinds of things that were affected by doing just something as what you would think as simple as that. For example, when we took a lane off of Huron and on Ontario, that made the lane widths for the remainder of the street, it changed them to some degree. I won't get into all the details of that, but we had to still maintain adequate lane widths for bus traffic and truck traffic, and also level of service types things, meaning like making sure we can still move traffic at an adequate rate through where the signal's at, even though that it means it's going to be a little bit not as, you might be queued up a little bit longer, but the city has taken a position where that's fine because we're prioritizing safety over this. And that's part of what the priority of this project is. But we had to significantly rework the project to be able to figure out how we restripe everything and do this to make all the stuff work. And it took several iterations of doing that. And so that's a lot of time spent with a design consultant trying to figure that out. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot of utilities in this area. We found all kind of like crazy duck banks that you wouldn't know, having to move utilities. We have to move those light poles back out of the way if we're going to extend this and create a path. All kind of stuff like that. Another big one that came up, and this is one that's forever true of every complete Green Street project, is drainage issues, right? We don't want to build something where this is going to impact we don't want freestanding water puddling up on the street in certain ways. And if you will move a curb, you are moving all the storm drain basins then. So you have to figure out how you're going to redo all that. You have to retie all that in. Well, on Huron, less of an issue, but on Ontario, where you're actually moving the curb out, what that does is you've moved the curb closer to the crown of the road. So the curb's coming up meeting at a higher elevation, which means that water on Ontario is going to have less of an ability to kind of like go down to the curb and drain out properly, it's going to be more flat. It's going to be standing water, and that's dangerous. That's very dangerous for hydroplaning and whatnot. So we had to figure out creative ways in how to address that. And also over on Huron, we found out that a whole catch basin is inoperable where we wanted to drain. So we had to redesign the intersection of Detroit and Huron to get that to drain in a way that was kind of acceptable to at least ODOT, because ODOT oversees, they're going to construct all of this. Then we found out that the Huron Bridge actually needs to be completely resurfaced and redecked because it has a failing kind of condition. So that was a complication that we had to like figure out, like, what do we build now so that if they redeck it, they put it right back to, if they have to do that, like what it will look like. So then there were other projects like the Stokes Federal Courthouse. They want to do a project in their parking lot and build a plaza, and they wanted to use the Memorial Bridges Loop as a vehicle drop-off area. And we said, no, we can't do that. So trying to coordinate with them on that. And then, of course, Bedrock is doing a project over here, the whole riverfront plan. How does that tie into their project? We've had to work through that. So what started as what seemingly would be a straightforward $1.4 million project with tons of extra roadway space, all this room to be able to do this, there's all these other considerations that go in when you get into the actual construction. This is just stuff the public doesn't, you guys will never know about. We in City Hall spend so much time working on all of this, on all the legislation that's needed, on all the details of all of that stuff on the construction side. It's a lot of work. So what that resulted in this case was an extra $500,000 that was added to the project, all that extra design work that had to be done. So where does that money come from? The city had to find that money. Oh, NOACA's not going to give us the extra money. We don't have any more of the federal earmarks. So we had to use our limited bond dollars that we already have earmarked for a lot of other projects. And it becomes this game of like, okay, what can we push off on this project here and use some of that money to pay for this now? That's a constant thing in City Hall that we're constantly trying to move those chess pieces around and figure that out. And it changes all the time. So this is one small example of a project that, is a smaller, we'll call it a complete Green Street project, but all the technicalities sometimes it goes into it and how we had to figure out the funding to make it happen. But we figured it out. It just takes, a team to do that. And it takes a lot of coordination and it takes willing partners to be able to do that. I don't have time to go through, we have 15 minutes. I want to save some time for Q&A. So what I will say is that I'm going to drop a link in the chat to my recent newsletter, which does this whole preview for you. And this year in particular, the last 3 years, we've been working on design on a lot of big projects. They're going to start coming to fruition this year. A lot of this stuff is going to start happening in construction. So I encourage you to check that newsletter link out and read through those because there's links to all the designs and projects and things like that. So take a look at that. It's exciting stuff. And hopefully this was a pretty good overview for you, but I'm going to stop there and I will answer any questions that you have, insults, complaints, any of the above.
Bill, I'll start us off with questions in the chat.
Okay.
One from Laura Marks. Does Cleveland have a green and complete streets checklist to ensure all details are addressed in design and build process?
I don't know if I wouldn't call it a checklist. I would say that through all of the vetting that we do through the TAC, through the public engagement, things like that, we go through everything that is possibly feasible that can be done because some things just we know can't be done on every project, whether it's the conditions of the street itself or funding or whatever it may be. So one thing that we do is when the TAC does give its comments, we are obligated to respond to those comments if we can't do something and explain why we could or could not do something like that. So we're getting into the point where we're going to start doing that because some of our first projects are starting to come online. So, but yeah, I would say just like through all the hands that touch a complete and Green Street project, you will see all the things that would be outlined in ordinance, but there's not like some actual list of things. It's like here's the 20 things on the project because each project has so much context to it. There's so many specific things that make that street so unique that a lot of those things might not apply to it. And there's some things maybe not on that list that would apply to it that we would add to it. So, but by the end, you will have a very transparent look at like all the comments that went into the design and the rationale behind it and things like that. So hopefully that is helpful.
Thanks, Phil. Another question. With unforeseen circumstances discovered during construction, does that have the potential to limit the project end state, like a protected bike lane becoming a regular painted bike lane mid-project? I think specifically for the Memorial Bridges Loop.
Yeah. So if I understand the question correctly, like if we ran into a construction complication, would we be able to do the design that we initially wanted to do? Like, would we have to alter the design, if I'm understanding correctly?
And I think, well, Robbie, and feel free to chime in if, but I also think specifically for Memorial Bridges Loop, are there any changes to the outcome of that
Oh,
project?
no, we are going to be able to just build it as designed. Yes. So we were
Okay.
fortunate that, and I went, to bat for the project with, making sure we found the extra, funding to be able to be able to do the design because it is incredibly important project in terms of safety. And so that was a priority and we figured that out. There are sometimes other things on other projects though, where maybe we can't do quite as much street greening as we want. We have to be a little bit more selective with that, or maybe we can't, as part of the construction of the actual roadway project portion, do things like add all the delineators or something like that. But we can do that as a follow-on project with some separate funding, like with working with planning or traffic engineering. They may have the ability to come in after the project's done and do that. A good example of that also is for the trees that get planted on these projects. Oftentimes, what we try to do is use the dollars to create the space for the street greening, so create the tree lawns, and then we come in on a follow-on project with money for tree plantings and then do the tree planting afterwards so that we can free up those dollars to build the best project we can during the capital phase and then come in on the back end with separate fundings or even other partners to help do the tree planting. So that would be an example. But to answer your question about Memorial Bridges Loop, no, that project is going to be as designed. If you go to the project website, you'll see I have all the latest designs, the actual very detailed design plans there. So you can take a look at it and see what it's going to look like. Shovels will start moving dirt in June and it should be done by the end of November. So you should be able to use it before the end of next year.
Phil, I
Sweet,
was
thanks.
I was more asking like in general because like you said a lot of these things have to go before everything has to go before city council, so it has to be approved. So if something is approved and then because of construction issues whatever might come up, does are changes allowed to be made?
Yeah, I mean, usually at the council phase, they're not the ones really kind of like vetting the projects. They're more like keeping an eye on, I would say, like the budget or the authorizations and things like that with the partnerships and things like that. They will ask questions about the project. They'll want to know more, and usually they use that as an opportunity to talk about some other projects that they are interested in, and they want updates on those. I would say the only thing that where construction usually the only things that's going to like change a project in construction phase is we try to identify a lot of that stuff as early as we can in the process so that when we get to construction there's no big surprises and we've accounted for everything, but there's inevitably sometimes things that you don't know until you start moving dirt out there. And but rarely, at least in my experience, I haven't seen anything where it's changed the final design of a project. There have been things where we've had to delay the final design. I'll give you an example. Payne Avenue. Payne Avenue is a roadway project that was initially going to be just a resurfacing project, and we got involved in that. The Complete Green Street and the mobility team, and found money to do design to make parking protected bike lanes and do a ton of street greening. So if you go out on Payne Avenue between 13th and 30th right now, you'll see a ton of new street greening. But what you don't see, the roads resurface, everything looks like it's done, but you don't see any bike lanes and none of the striping other than the center line down the road because we had to wait until the project was done to come in on the back end and do the striping plan for that. So we kind of pulled that out of the construction phase because we didn't want to do an inferior project. It wasn't something that we could account for in construction, but we're going to do it as a follow-on because planning got involved and found some additional funding to be able to do that. So it's we try to identify any of those construction things in advance, but that is still part of the design phase. Like when you're identifying those construction issues, everything I talked about with Memorial Bridges Loop, that was after we got through preliminary design. When we started getting into detailed engineering design, that is like that is when you discover that stuff. And so you try to start to figure that out. But it does add project costs. It added a $500,000 to Memorial Bridges Loop project, which is like an additional, that's an additional fourth of funding, that we had already, or a third actually. And so we figured it out. We didn't compromise on design. So we still, if these are projects that we are prioritizing like this, we try to find a way to figure it out.
Thank you for the clarification, Robbie.
Thanks, and Phil. Thank you.
Another question. Lucinda asked, does anyone have a solution to crashes caused by vehicles turning left into bicyclists and pedestrians in a crosswalk? So many 2025 crashes this happen. Want to shout out Lucinda for spending the last month reading dozens and dozens of crash reports as a volunteer for Bike Cleveland. And we did talk a little more in the chat about centerline hardening and bike boxes. But if you have any more thoughts, Phil.
Well, first of all, yeah, thank you, Cinda, for doing that work, and like the other members too, because my girlfriend Christine, who's watching upstairs here, I'm at her place, she's plowing through a number of those reports too, and she shares with me those up, what she's finding as well, and it's really important work that you guys are doing because it really does help inform like what we call countermeasures to like things like that. But I would say like some of the quickest intervention for left-hand turns are really things like the centerline hardening in particular. Anything that makes a motorist have to slow down and make a more deliberate movement, because as here, as you see in the reports, even 1 second difference can make the difference between a strike and not a strike. So slowing a vehicle down, even by a second, is important. Centerline hardening is one example of a quick intervention. Another is a leading pedestrian interval. That is like where if a car's here at the light and the pedestrian's here and they're looking to cross the street and the car's looking to make a left at the light, having the pedestrian signal activate first to give them 5, 7, or 10 seconds first to clear the lane, get through, then the car gets the green arrow and go. There was an unfortunate fatality on West 58th Street in Detroit Shoreway here, where we learned by reading those reports that seems to be what happened. Was the pedestrian, they both had the signal at the same time to go, and maybe it was distracted driving or whatnot, but there was a left turn and the vehicle struck the person. They were doing the right thing. They were crossing that. So what our design intervention or countermeasure there is adding an LPI, doing the centerline hardening, and also buffering that whole area, daylighting it so it narrows down the crossing width of for the pedestrian there. So I think you'll see more of that happening moving forward. We're going to try to be doing a lot of quick build projects to look at that data that you guys are identifying and try to intervene there with the quick build work.
Thanks, Phil. Another question, do projects that cross city boundaries have extra hurdles that make those projects more difficult to move forward? Specifically here in Lakewood, I know they're putting a multi-purpose trail on Bunce Road, but I haven't heard if there will be any updates to this street when it hits Cleveland and becomes West 140th. Phil, I don't know how tied you are with West 140th, but I could also talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, I'm not so tied into that, but I can tell you that there is yet another entity that does these roadway projects, and that's the county. And the county gets involved in projects when they cross jurisdictions like that. They usually will be the ones that will kind of lead those kind of projects. The county is leading the West 140th Street project, and Jenna, you can talk a little bit more about the design detail. But yes, it does require coordination, and there's other examples where we did it, like East 185th in North Collinwood. Half of that borders Euclid, city of Euclid, but we wanted to do a complete Green Street design there. So They participated and added funds into that project and coordinated with us. We have to do all kind of like legislation and agreements. That's all the boring stuff that the public will never know about, but it takes lots of work on staff work to do all that stuff. Jen, if you want to talk about West 140th, though.
Sure. I also don't know a ton of details. I will say that West 140th, starting where it turns into Cleveland around Lakewood Heights, um, is on the Cleveland Moves plan to have separated bike lanes. I don't know the details about, especially the section between the highway and Triscuit because the right of way is not huge there, and so there's not totally room for a separated bike lane. But then once it hits south of Triscuit, there's a ton of room, and that is also included in the Cleveland Moves plan to get separated bike lanes. The West 140th south of Lorraine is scheduled to be resurfaced and is going to be redone, but they aren't adding any bike lanes. Again, right of way there is not very wide. And there's not trail projects. I don't know, Phil, you could talk about this at all, but trail projects are way more expensive than like a quick build bike lane where you
Yes.
just add plastic posts. Um, and then I wanted to say too, for things across cities, very frequently, at least in my experience, cities are on different kind of schedules for when streets are going to be redone. And most of these projects that we're talking about are happening because the pavement condition is bad, and so that means it's going to get redone. And so, for example, Lee Road, is being redone, or yeah, it's being redone in Shaker, and there's a separated bike facility planned. And then when it gets to the Cleveland side, it is also set to be redone. And it's really helpful when one city makes a good design choice because it helps push the other city to make a good design choice. So I think Bunce Road, I think, makes the case for Cleveland to make that connectivity um better. Um, Another question. How can one advocate for a project that is not a part of your ward? I want to advocate for a park on the Brown Stadium, but am technically in Ward 8, despite being a 15-minute walk from the stadium. How can I make my voice heard in a situation like this?
Um, I would first start with your council person because council people are who a lot of the city administration listens to, believe it or not, like the department heads and whatnot. That's a unique situation with the North Coast connector and the Brown Stadium now being new RFP. There's a whole the North Coast Waterfront Development Corporation working exclusively on that. But I would say really like council people are, if they're hearing it from their constituents that something's important, that is a big project like that, that's important because um, they they're the ones that are going to ask us questions about design. This is good and bad. So that oftentimes they hear from people who their constituents don't like a project, and so then they're going to the city council table to talk to the administration publicly about why they don't like something or what they're hearing from their constituents. So, and sometimes the opposite can be true, but oftentimes, if it's something that you're advocating for that you want to see happen, that is something that will, I think, in my experience anyway, when they hear from constituents that they do really like something, it takes a little bit of the edge off of maybe some of their critique and it makes it a little bit more of a productive conversation because we can talk about the details of what maybe should happen, not whether or not something should happen or not. So it is important to first start with your council person. Just shoot them even as simple as an email, a short email. That is an important thing. Then in a project like that, there has been a lot of community engagement. I would say never miss the opportunity to leave a comment on anything that you can, because all of that stuff actually does get recorded and read. We pay consultants millions of dollars to put all that stuff together and look at that. And yes, I mean, in city planning, oftentimes it's, and there's truth to this. The public's always skeptical. It's like, well, you guys already have the plan that you want already in mind, and this is not that important, or there's just going to be minor details we can change. Sometimes that's true. But for when it comes to big projects like that, it is really actually very important to hear from the community because you're making a huge bet. Like we're spending 400 to $500 million on that, and we're passing a tax increment financing district downtown. So this is a big bet for the city of Cleveland. So it is important to, I would say, leave every comment you can on any public available website, but definitely contact your council people, because the council person is the body that is going to be the most vocal about whether something happens or does not happen.
Yes, and I will add too, I think, um, especially yes, for a large scale project like that, I think interest kind of crosses board boundaries, and I'm sure the councilperson in Ward 8 is going to be very interested in what happens to the stadium site. I also think NOACA is kind of an underrated and often forgotten decision maker in all of this, and they're, across multiple counties. Are involved in some of the conversations happening around, especially streets around the new stadium and what's going to happen in the old stadium. And then I think too, in my experience, um, not forgetting about city administrators. I'm sorry, Phil. I know you get a million emails all the time. But I think folks that are directly working on that project in the city are happy to take, input.
Yeah, I
Um,
would say, right. I don't disagree with that, but you're also reminding me something I want to mention tonight. It's like, what do people like me have control over and not? And like in this case, like, yes, that is important. But one thing that I do want to highlight is I get so many emails about maintenance, like, why aren't we sweeping the bike lanes more? Why aren't we doing this or that? And that is all valid. And I share those same frustrations. But I think one thing that we have to do in City Hall is better educate the public about who does what, because my job, I spend a lot of time working on actually building the bike lane, and or finding the money and working on the legislation, all that. And I am just as frustrated that we aren't able to maintain some of these things, but that is a completely different department. That is public works, and I have no control over it. So I don't want to I don't want to not respond to an email, but at the same time, like, it can be difficult in our roles as the planners of projects that the public understands like what we have control over. And even if it's like, well, I just know that he might get this message to the right person. It's like it's actually that's difficult for us, because like we get all those emails, and we're already kind of like short staffed to work on the planning aspect of things. So just putting that out there as a general note, that like, happy to try to direct people sometimes to like who the best folks are to advocate for the things you want to see. But um, we at City Hall also have to do maybe a better job of like making that clear to folks, because
yeah.
it is a lot. We get a lot of emails about those kind of things.
Yes. Yes. And I also think there are specific administrators that are meant to talk like for this, as in anyone in like the mayor's office who's like over specific projects are kind of, meant to do that, and not necessarily someone who's like over the day-to-day stuff. So I definitely think looking at who's in the mayor's office that works on Lakefront, for example, or whatever your interest is, um, looking at his cabinet would be helpful. That was our last question, I think, and also we're at time, so thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Phil, so much. Let's give Phil a virtual round of applause. Um, Thank you, Phil. This has been recorded and will be posted on our YouTube. Um, and there are more trainings. So I think a lot of folks here, when you signed up for a bunch of the topics, but if not, the same registration link that you used to get here, you will use to register for the other topics next month. We are joined by the Parking Reform Network, which is an organization that works nationally around parking reform policies. Um, and they're gonna come talk to us about how we deal with parking, and how we make it better. So excited for that. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And Phil, I don't know if you want to say one more thing about your future.
Oh, sure. I guess I could. This is actually I'm one of my final acts wearing the Complaint Green Street Act. In 2 weeks, I'll be moving over to the Cleveland Foundation. I got a job at the Cleveland Foundation, and I'll be leading up their Vibrant Neighborhoods initiative. So we'll be going like all in on a handful of neighborhoods in Cleveland and really trying to figure out like how we can leverage a lot of the resources out there now and that includes the work we're talking about here. They're like the Wade Park Avenue project and others. How we can help support that and add more funding to these projects, quick builds, tree planting, mobility work, but also other things like home repair and wealth building for residents and educational related stuff. So I'll be moving over there in 2 weeks, but you'll still be seeing me at all the things. I will be at many of the Better Street meetings, and I'll be at the Bike Cleveland event, and I'll just be wearing a different hat. The idea here is to like divide and conquer, and just bring more resources to the work. So, thanks, Jenna, for the opportunity there to share that.
Thank you, Phil. Really quick, one more thing. If you're new here, if this is maybe your first Bike Cleveland event, I want to plug two things. One is our Better Street committees. And so if you're in the city of Cleveland, many neighborhoods have resident groups that meet and talk about improving safety and mobility in their neighborhoods. Those meet monthly. I will, as I'm talking, find the link and drop it. And then if you're outside the city of Cleveland, we also have many chapters that are doing amazing work. Um, and I will also drop the link for that. But if you're looking to be more involved, these are two great ways to do it. I'm getting the local chapters link and dropping it. Great. I'll stay here for a minute or two if anyone needs to chat, but thank you guys so much for taking the time tonight.